Welcome everyone. I'm Mujahid Bilici. I'm academic director at Zahra Institute and also associate professor of sociology at John Jay College, City University of New York. It's my pleasure to host and moderate the event today. Our guest is Professor Djene Bajalan, Djene Bajalan. He's associate professor of history at Missouri State University. And he holds degrees from SOAS, LSE, Istanbul Bilgi University. He received his PhD from University of Oxford in Oriental Studies. And he specializes on questions of nationalism in late 19th and 20th centuries, specifically in Ottoman Empire and the rise of Kurdish nationalism, more or less the topic of the talk today. Djene is a scholar, academic, podcaster, as far as I know, and a big fan of Dune. That's another interesting aspect of Djene. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all. And so, Djene, I would like you to briefly tell us about your background, because myself included, people might be curious. You are British Kurdish. What's your kind of background that would also help us get oriented?
Yeah, sure. So, I'm half Kurdish, half British. I was born and brought up in the United Kingdom in, the city of Hull in the north of Great Britain. When I was growing up, there were only two Kurdish families, my family, my father, and one other Kurdish family. But of course, our families didn't talk because of political differences, the usual story. And obviously, growing up in a predominantly English background with in a quite not very diverse city, I became interested in Kurdish identity and national identity more generally. What does it mean to identify with a particular community? Why do we identify with a particular community? How does this all how does this all come together? How do our identities affect our politics, our orientation, the way that we view the world? So, growing up, obviously, I became interested with these topics and, studied at university. And then, in 2004, I, moved to Kurdistan. And then later I moved to Turkey to, continue my studies, to focus on the Ottoman period, which I find very interesting. And, began studying the rise of the Kurdish movement, the origins of the Kurdish question, the beginnings of Kurdish nationalism. And, this is what I wrote my PhD thesis on. And I was previously working in the American University of Iraq in Suleimania. And then I got this position here in Missouri and came here. And, I've continued my engagement with Kurdish history and politics, but also linking it to broader trends of nationalism. I think, often in area studies, we become highly over-specialized. So I try to draw comparisons and links to other movements around the world and see how these things compare. So these are the things I'm interested in. Beyond that, I have two small children, spend a lot of time with them. And as Dr. Bilici pointed out, I am a big Dune fan, and I'm very glad that everybody else has become a Dune fan of late. So I feel not so isolated.
Well, thank you. That was a great background information for us. And yeah, so the floor is yours. What's the Young Turk Revolution and the emergence of Kurdish nationalism, Kurdish movement? Yeah.
I'm happy to begin. So my talk is entitled The Young Turk Revolution and the Birth of the Kurdish Movement. And I specifically use the word movement as opposed to nationalism because, of course, nationalism is a kind of sticky word which has many different meanings depending on the context. There are different academic definitions of it. There are, vernacular definitions of it. And I use the term movement specifically to call into question some of the assumptions about the early Kurdish movement and its relationship to Kurdish nationalism. And What I mean by in that sense is when we think of nationalism, we, often think of it in terms of the desire of a people or a movement to create a particular nation state. That is certainly one aspect of Kurdish politics and one that is a very strong trend in the Kurdish movement. But not the Kurdish movement is broader than just the question of statehood. The Kurdish question is broader than just the question of Kurdish statehood. There are a whole group of interrelated questions that come from this idea of the Kurds being a nation. First and foremost, of course, are the Kurds a nation? And then what are the political, social, and economic implications of the Kurds being a nation? And there are, different reactions to this historically within the Kurdish movement. Nationalism, that is the quest for a nation state, is not the only form of Kurdish politics. And this is kind of what I'm going to be touching on today by looking at the emergence of the Kurdish movement as an organized force in civil society, in the political field, in the realm of politics in the late Ottoman era. So I wanted to give a little introduction about the talk I'm giving today. So the 1908 Young Turk Revolution marked a significant turning point in both Ottoman and Kurdish history. And it marked a new phase in the evolution of modern Kurdish political activism, which with the beginning of a sustained and organizationally distinct Kurdish movement manifest in the formation of the first legal Kurdish civil society organization, the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress. So there's a couple of key questions I'm going to be going over today. One, of course, is what was the Young Turk Revolution? Then, of course, how did the Kurds respond to the revolution? And what was the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress, and what explains its political orientation? And I'll get down to that question towards the end of the talk. So let's begin here with what the Young Turk Revolution is. So the Young Turk Revolution happens in 1908, but to understand its significance, we really need to go back to, we can go right back to the beginning of the 19th century, but I think a good place to start is 1876. In 1876, there's a political, economic, and social crisis in the Ottoman Empire, and there is the overthrow of Sultan Abdulaziz, who had been attempting to assert his prerogatives as the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. He's overthrown in a coup d'etat. A new sultan is enthroned, Sultan Murad, but he proves to be mentally unstable, and in late 1876, Sultan Abdul Hamid ascends to the throne of the Ottoman Empire and grants the Ottoman Empire its first constitution, the Kanuni Esasi. However, in 1877, in the midst of the Russian-Ottoman War, the 93 Harbi, which, as it's known in Turkish, Sultan Abdul Hamid dissolves the parliament, and he doesn't so much suspend the constitution. The constitution remains in force, but he uses the prerogatives in the constitution to establish himself as a constitutional autocrat and rules as an autocrat for the next 3 decades. And it's during this period we see the emergence of the quote-unquote Young Turk movement. In 1899, on the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution, a group of progressive students in the Imperial Medical College established a secret revolutionary organization dedicated to the restoration of constitutional rule. And this marks the beginning of really organized opposition to the autocracy of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Now, several factions emerge over the subsequent decades, the most significant of which is the Committee of Union and Progress, the CUP, or as it's known in Turkish, the İttihad ve Terakki Cemiyeti. Now, I will say here, the kind of core of the most significant faction, the Committee of Union and Progress, undergoes a couple of name changes. It's, after 1902, after a split in the movement, the main faction becomes the Committee of Progress and Union, and they rebrand themselves after the revolution. But it's best to think of the Committee of Union and Progress as being this kind of main faction that emerges within the Young Turks movement. And over time, the movement attracts support from various elements of the Ottoman intellectual and political elite, many of whom are critical of the Hamidian autocracy. And in the early 20th century, we see sympathetic committees being established within the Ottoman military. And eventually, on July the 3rd, 1908, officers in the Balkans sympathetic to the opposition launch an insurrection against the autocracy, demanding the restoration of constitutional rule. This movement is spearheaded by Niazi Bey and then later Enver Bey, who would become the famous Enver Pasha. And this rebellion, basically, it becomes impossible for the Sultan to suppress it. His attempts to mobilize troops in Anatolia to fight against the rebels in the Balkans fails. And on July the 23rd, 24th, the Sultan issues a decree providing for the convention of a new General Assembly, Meclis-i Mumiye, and this marks the beginning of what is known in Turkish history as the second constitutional period, the first constitutional period being that brief year after the granting of the Ottoman constitution by Sultan Abdulhamid. So the Young Turk Revolution, within its historical context, it can be seen as part of a wave of revolutions that Lenin called the awakening of Asia. We have, during the early 20th century, a series of constitutional revolutions, revolutionary liberalism, as it were, overthrowing regimes in Russia, of course, with the 1905 Russian Revolution, the 1905-1906 Iranian Constitutional Revolution, 1911-1912 Chinese Constitutional Revolution. So we have this wave of revolutionary liberalism across Asia during this period, and the Young Turks Revolution can be seen as part of those revolutionary movements, a movement designed to establish a constitutional regime in the Ottoman Empire at a time to establish a constitutional order in the Ottoman Empire through the restoration of the Ottoman Parliament and the representative institutions provided for in the Kanuni Esasi, the Ottoman Constitution. So that's what the Young Turk Revolution was. It was a revolution that overthrew the autocracy of Sultan Abdulhamid and established a constitutional political order. Now, the image of the Young Turks obviously is deeply impacted by the events of the First World War, most notably the Armenian genocide, the rise of Pan-Turkism and Islamism, etc., etc. But it's important to remember that during this early phase of the revolution, the year 1908 to 1909, we see in the Ottoman Empire a kind of springtime of peoples. And here I'm calling back to the springtime of peoples in Europe in 1848. And the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, seeks to bring back a liberal form of Ottomanism. During the 19th century, especially during the Tanzimat period, during the middle of the 19th century, there had been an attempt to transform the concept of Ottomanism into a form of official nationalism of the Ottoman Empire. During the Tanzimat, this form of Ottomanism had been heavily influenced by liberal ideas of civic, political, and legal equality. One of the defining developments of the Tanzimat period was the gradual legal emancipation of non-Muslim communities. However, by the end of the Tanzimat period in the 1870s, there is a kind of Islamic backlash to this, which Sultan Abdulhamid takes advantage of, establishing his autocracy and promoting a new, more Islamic form of of Ottoman national identity. It didn't mean a complete rejection of this civic model of Ottoman national identity. You know, the legal emancipation of non-Muslims remained on the books in the Ottoman Empire, but during the Hamidian period, there were both ideological appeals to Muslims, the reinvention of, for example, the position of the caliphate, the re-emphasis on the Islamic character of the Ottoman Empire, and of course the distribution of patronage and financial and material support to Muslim elites who had felt left out by the reforms of the Tanzimat period. So in its initial phase, the Committee of Union and Progress is seeking to not only revive, but kind of take to the next level this civic form of Ottomanism that emerged during the Tanzimat and culminated in the establishment of a constitutional order and a parliament. And this liberal Ottomanism is expressed in the Committee of Union and Progress's party program. They declare everyone, regardless of religion, race or religion, possesses complete equality and freedom and is subject to the same obligations. All Ottomans are equal in the eyes of the law and in terms of rights and duties. All subjects will be eligible for appropriate official posts according to their competencies and aptitudes. Non-Muslims will be subject to the law of conscription. So here we have this idea that the Ottoman Empire will move away from the kind of system of patronage and support for Muslim elites within the bureaucracy that Abdul Hamid had followed towards a more meritocratic system, and a meritocratic system that would open up positions to all members of Ottoman society, Muslim and non-Muslim. One interesting thing here on that last point, Muslims had technically been subject to the conscript law since the mid-19th century, but they'd been able to get out of doing that by paying a particular tax to avoid military service. The Young Turks see military service as extremely important in national cohesion, and so non-Muslims begin to be conscripted into the military as well. So the overthrow of the autocracy, which, you know, had suppressed civil society in the Ottoman Empire through its complicated system of spies and journalgies, all these people were spying on each other. Really, you know, the Hamidian regime, although on the surface looks like a traditionalist regime, really is a kind of prototype for the modern Middle Eastern dictatorship. So we see this suppression of civil society. So obviously with the revolution, there was an explosion in civil society in terms of a proliferation of newspapers and periodicals freely available, as well as a host of societies and associations claiming to represent all manners of groups, interests, and causes. These, of course, included professional associations. It included associations such as the Ottoman Navy Association, scientific associations, and of course, given the multi-ethnic and multi-confessional nature of Ottoman society, it also included the formation of a host of quote-unquote national clubs, associations, and societies. Societies, clubs, and associations that sought to represent the interests of various ethno-national constituents within the Ottoman Empire through civil society. Now, the disposition of the various Ottoman communities towards the constitution varied. You know, there was a general positive reception towards the revolution from both Muslims and non-Muslims, but especially with regard to non-Muslims, there was perhaps more skepticism about the constitutional order and whether it can revive the Ottoman Empire. And for many non-Muslim communities, especially those who had external homelands such as Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, there was perhaps a little bit less enthusiasm about this new revolutionary order. But what is interesting is when we look at Muslim nationalities in the Ottoman Empire, we see the formation also of a number of different societies. So we have the Society for Arab Ottoman Fraternity, the Circassian Union for Union and Mutual Aid, and the Albanian Union. And these societies were interesting in that they defended a kind of multicultural Ottoman nationalism in the sense that within their organizational documents, their Nisam Namas, they sought to protect they sought to support the Ottoman constitutional orders. So, for example, the Society for the Arab Ottoman Fraternity saw as its task as defending the constitution, the Sultanate, propagating Ottoman patriotism, encouraging fraternal relations between Arabs and other Ottoman nationalities. And in general, these groups viewed the national question, or at least their community's national question, as being primarily related to questions of education and economic modernization within the framework of a constitutional empire. These associations were often dominated by intellectual and political elites, many of whom had been educated in the modernized Ottoman school system, and they sought to reconcile a kind of ethno-national, let's say cultural nationalism with an Ottoman political nationalism, Ottomanism. Ottomanism, obviously within the concept of Ottomanism, there are, more Turkish nationalist and more Islamist interpretations of what that term came to mean, but it was a loose enough term that it could be appropriated by non-Turkish nationalities. Professor Bozarslan has written on this, the Ottomanism of non-Turkish communities. So we see a kind of Ottoman patriotism, but one that does not reject the existence of a distinct cultural identity for various ethnic and national groups in the Ottoman Empire. So there was this attempt to reconcile cultural nationalism with Ottoman political nationalism, Ottomanism. So let's turn now to the Kurds. So when the revolution takes place, we see amongst the Kurdish intelligentsia various responses. And I have two responses here from two individuals who had very different politics. One is Abdullah Cevdet, one of the original founders of the initial cell of the Committee of Union and Progress, and a huge advocate of positivism, modern science, and westernization. When he heard about the revolution from his exile, while he was in exile, he wrote this article, this pamphlet called A Call, Bir Hutba, where he writes, "My compatriots, today is the festival of freedom. Come one and all, let us make peace, all citizens, Turk, Arab, Kurd, Albanian, Armenians, Greeks, Bulgarians, and Jews. In short, Muslims and non-Muslims, all citizens embrace one another." So for Abdullah Cevdet, this was a moment in which all the Ottoman communities could come together under the rubric of what within Ottoman terminology was known as the unity of elements, the Ittihadi al-Nasa, and by elements they meant ethno-national and sectarian communities. So there was an idea of a kind of Ottoman patriotism that would embrace the Ottoman Empire's diverse population and diverse cultures. Another individual who welcomed the revolution was Saidi Kurdi, again, very different from Abdullah Cevdet, an individual greatly committed to the Islamic modernist political project, and he too welcomes the revolution. "The new constitutional government has been born like a miracle," he writes, and goes on to say, "Ottomans should learn aspects of Western knowledge useful for the progress of civilization." So this revolution was seen as an opportunity by the Kurdish intelligentsia across the political spectrum. And this positive disposition was very soon given institutional and organizational shape in the formation of the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress. Now, the Kurdish Society of Mutual Aid and Progress, just so that people are aware, it was established in Istanbul in 1908, and its founding was attended by 500 intellectuals and notables residing in the capital of Istanbul. It's important to recognize at this period many Kurdish intellectual and political elites lived in Istanbul, worked in Istanbul, and there was also a fairly large Kurdish working class in Istanbul, primarily employed in the as porters in the capital. Accounting for about 6% of Istanbul's population. So you have the very elite of Kurdish society, the most educated, as well as people who had very prestigious backgrounds relating to Kurdish notables, and of course, there was an overlap between those who were sort of modern educated intellectuals and who also had notable backgrounds. They met in the Venitçiler, the money changers district of Istanbul, and established this organization under the leadership of Sheikh Abdul Qadir Effendi, who was the son of Sheikh Ubaydullah, who of course led the first nationalist revolt against the Ottoman Empire in the early 1880s, and who himself had been involved in the Young Turks. Its vice president was Field Marshal Ismail Pashazadeh Ahmed, who was a member of the Ottoman royal family through marriage. And, in addition to many kind of intellectuals from less prestigious backgrounds, it also included members of the Bedr Khan family. I'm sure I don't need to explain who the Bedr Khans are, and the Baban family, another important Kurdish family, both families descending from the Kurdish emirs who had ruled in Kurdistan prior to the Tanzimat era. And the CUP's response to the formation of the society was generally quite positive. On October 6, 1908, the CUP newspaper Tannen carried a notice announcing that influential ulama, sheikhs, and tribal leaders from amongst the Kurds, as well as intellectuals, had established an organization to work for the unity of all individuals, regardless of ethno-racial differences, to spread education, to extend equality, and to put an end to national enmity amongst the tribes and clans, which has been a stain on the moral character of the Kurds for centuries, and to guarantee the intellectual development of this important Ottoman element, which is in its character both pure and resolute. So the Committee of Union and Progress looked favorably on the formation of this new civil society organization. And of course, they weren't wrong in terms of the political orientation of the society. Its Nisam Nama, its organizational document, its charter, its constitution, however you want to translate it, lays out the objectives of the organization. And this includes introducing the constitution, which is in accordance with Islamic law and guarantees the prosperity of the nation, i.e. the Ottoman nation, and the security of the homeland, i.e. the Ottoman homeland, to Kurds who are not aware of it, to defend constitutional government and the parliament, which are the main paths of religion and progress, to intensify the bond between the Kurds and the authority of the Caliphate and Sultanate, to promote good relation between the Kurds and other citizens belonging to other Ottoman elements, such as Armenians, Nestorians, and so on, eliminating common conflicts that arise from time to time between the tribes, and create an atmosphere where they can live within the unity of the law, and to publish on education, trade, industry, trade, and agriculture. So certainly this program is a Kurdish-orientated program. It is a program that is predicated upon the idea that the Kurds constitute a distinct community, a distinct nationality. But in terms of political nationalism, there's nothing here about the formation of a Kurdish state or even some kind of Kurdish autonomy. The main questions that are being posed in this Nisam Nama relate to the material progress of the Kurds, ensuring Kurds have better relations with other Ottoman groups, and acting on behalf of the constitutional order to spread pro-constitutionalist ideas amongst the Kurdish population. A Kurdish population which, especially in the West, had received an enormous amount of bad press during the Hamidian period due to the involvement of Kurdish tribes in the attacks on Armenian agriculturalists in Ottoman Kurdistan during this period. So there is an attempt to kind of bring the Kurds to modernity, as it were, through the framework of a constitutional order. And this, I call this kind of ideological mix Kurdish Ottomanism. And why I use that term is that it is not a rejection of a Kurdish identity, and it is not a rejection of an Ottoman identity, but it is an attempt to reconcile these two identities. For many of those who established this organization, there was no contradiction between being a patriotic Kurd and a patriotic Ottoman. A good comparison, for example, from Europe might be unionism amongst Scots during the 19th century. You had Scottish you had organizations and associations established to promote Scottish interests, but they did not necessarily reject a broader British national identity. The same with the Welsh movement, the same with other movements in other multinational empires like Austria-Hungary and the Tsarist Empire. And we see this Kurdish Ottomanism being expressed in the society's publication, the Kürt Teavun ve Teraki gazetesi. We have a couple of quotes here from various articles. For example, in one Kurdish article from Khalil Hayali, he writes, "Let us protect the honor of Kurdishness. Let us with our lives and properties try to protect the homeland. O Kurds, love our Ottoman homeland. For the love of homeland comes from faith. O brothers, remove enmity and conflict from your heart. Make peace and take heed of the commandment. All believers are brothers." Another article, again, published in Kurdish, obviously directed towards Kurdish speakers. Our nation's name is Kurd, Millete Me, Kurde. All Kurds are one. Our cities are blessed. Our country is subject to the government of the sublime Ottoman state. We are Ottoman subjects, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Jews, Yazidis, Nestorians. We are all equal as we live within Ottoman territory. We are one. There is no difference between us. Our names and the names of our other blessed lands are always Ottoman. Our country is the Ottoman country. So again, here we have an expression of a kind of idea that there is no tension between being part of a cultural nation, the Kurds, as well as being part of a political nation, the Ottoman nation. And we see this, of course, with with Kurds defending the interests of the state. For example, the ongoing crisis on the island of Crete, where you have a contestation between Greeks and Turkish-speaking Muslims on the island over the status of Crete, which had been placed on a kind of autonomous administration, but remained part of the Ottoman Empire. As the issue became hotter, the Kürt Teavun ve Teraki gazetesi published articles talking about the protest movements against Greek attempts to annex the island. And we hear here a speech given by a Kurdish individual who attended one of these protests, where he says, "We, in the name of the Kurdish people, declare and swear before you that we, the Kurds, like our ancestors, will not accept even one stone of the island of Crete being surrendered to the enemy without making a hill of our bones beneath the castles and walls of Crete. We would like to declare and proclaim that we share in the feelings and desires of our Cretan compatriots. Long live national unity, long live Crete." So again here, and I have a little picture on the side here, a picture of the island of Crete was published in the newspaper. So again, the members of the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress very much not only identify with Ottomanism, but also identify strongly with the interests of the state within the context of this new constitutional order. And this brings us to the question of relations between the Kurds and the CUP more specifically. So not only are they defending Ottomanism, not only are they defending the interests of the Ottoman state more broadly, but also the society viewed the Committee of Union and Progress with a positive attitude. So, for example, in a statement printed in the Kürt Teavun ve Teraki gazetesi, it was declared that the association supports and accepts the aspirations and initiatives necessary for the splendor and development of the Ottoman state, and supports all the causes within the political program published by the CUP, which assures the good health and progress of the Ottoman homeland. Another article, this time a Kurdish language article, writes, "The supremacy of the constitution along with Islamic law must be protected." The author continues by praising the program of the CUP, which he describes as being for the health and health of the homeland and the progress of all. Interestingly enough, the author of this piece was Suleymani Tawfik, who is better known to scholars of Kurdish literature as Piramerd. He became a very well-known Sorani language poet. Another article, this time again published in Kurdish by Halil Hayali, thanks to the efforts of the CUP and with the help of the military, he proclaims, the constitution has emerged and the woes of tyranny from which we had suffered disappeared. So again, there is this kind of positive disposition towards the Committee of Union and Progress in this revolutionary honeymoon period. So given that these individuals were so close to, and this is, this I should add here, if you look at the picture here, I have a picture here of Babanzadeh Ismail Hakkibey, who was another member of the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress, and who was himself also a unionist and elected on the unionist ticket as the MP for Baghdad. He later on would serve briefly as the Minister of Education in the Ottoman Empire, and even during his tenure provided funding for a Kurdish school in Istanbul. So it's not surprising, given the fact that some members of this organization were also members of the Committee on Union and Progress, that they viewed the Committee of Union and Progress as a political ally. So what was the point of having this organization? Well, that is indicated in its Nisam Nama, where it highlights its objectives, and its objectives are primarily to assist in the national revival of the Kurds, which is viewed not through the lens of statehood, but through the lens of broader social, cultural, and economic modernity. When conceptualizing the Kurdish question, and perhaps this is somewhat difficult for us today to conceptualize it, they did not view it in terms of national oppression, in so much as they viewed it as in the terms of the pathologies that existed within Kurdish society. Said Nursi, Said Kurdi, for example, wrote that Kurds have three enemies that are destroying us. The first is poverty. The condition of 40,000 porters in Istanbul is a prime example of this enemy's attacks. The second is ignorance, which with the help of the assault of the first enemy, let us find a path to the liberation of 40,000 porters made helpless by poverty and for whom not even 1 in 100 can read a newspaper. The third is our ignorance of conflict and ignorant conflict and enmity. So Said Nursi lays out the problems as being economic, poverty, ignorance, education, and conflict and enmity, Kurds fighting with Kurds, tribal conflict, etc., etc. Again, in a similar article, Babanzadeh Ismail Hakkibey, in an article called About the Kurdish Language, he argues that however backwards, however lacking in language, literature, science, and knowledge Kurds are, Albanians, and so on remain, the Ottoman state will be to the degree impoverished. Strength and progress is found in knowledge. Knowledge is built upon language. So in this article, Babanzadeh Ismail Hakkibey makes a case for Kurdish language education, not simply in Kurdish nationalist terms, but in Ottoman terms, saying that education for Kurds and other mother tongue education for Kurds and other Ottoman nationalities is critical for bringing them into modernity and ensuring that they are going to be able to contribute to the broader Ottoman community. So modernity is critical to this idea. A second important aspect of the organization, which is at times explicit but also implicit, is the question of national leadership. And here I mean national leadership of the Kurdish community. So where does this society fit in with this new constitutional order? Well, this is a period in which, again, this might be difficult for us to conceptualize today, perhaps less so for people in Turkey where there is still a vibrant civil society, but there's this idea that civil society can occupy and Kurdish activism within civil society can be a way through which the Kurdish elite can act as the appropriate intermediaries between the state and broader Kurdish society. So, for example, in a proclamation, again, directed towards the Kurdish community, Sayyid Ahmed Shevki states, from this day forth, if they officials harm you or cause ruin to you, turn to the Society of Kurdistan. If an official commits an evil against you or oppresses you, report it to the government. If they do not pay heed, then write to the Society of the Kurds in Istanbul. They will pay heed. The society is founded upon the ideas of the government and does not accept any villainy. So there's this idea that the Kurdish society in Istanbul will be an organization through which Kurds who suffer from the government can go to, and they will act on behalf of Kurdish interests to ensure that they are not Kurds are not oppressed by the government. So the society sees itself as this intermediary to help translate the demands of Kurds in the provinces to the new government in Istanbul. And the society was very keenly aware of who the people who should be the intermediates should be. If you look at the regulations pertaining to the consultative committee of the organization, the kind of governing body, it points out that its members should reside in Istanbul, be over the age of 25, and should not be known for any misdeeds and be possessed of good morals, to not being convicted of any crimes or misdemeanors, and be from amongst the ulama, sheikhs, the notables, and the masters of virtue and perfection, possessed of honor and esteem. So the appropriate national leadership was seen in both moral and educational and also family terms. So there's this idea that there is a kind of ruling class of the Kurds, and they are the people who should be at the leadership of this organization. So there's this kind of aristocratic elan to it, a kind of noblesse obligée amongst this Kurdish elite. So this organization, I would argue, marks the kind of apogee of Kurdish Ottomanism, at least amongst the Kurdish political elite. And to understand why this is the case, we need to really look at the Kurdish intelligentsia and its relationship with the Young Turk movement more broadly. You know, the Ottoman reform process during the 19th century gave rise to a caste of Muslim professionals and intellectuals, individuals who had been schooled in the empire's reformed education system and who, by and large, found employment in the ever-expanding bureaucracy of the Ottoman state. And it was as part of this new governing class that the Kurdish professional and intellectual elite was formed. So this elite was very much tied materially and culturally to the broader Ottoman governing class, the intellectual class that had come into being during the 19th century. The Ottoman word for intellectual, of course, is munaver, and of course we see, you know, the Turkified translation today is aydin, which has the same meaning, or in Kurdish, roshanbiye, you know, which all reflects this concept of a new intellectual elite, but an intellectual elite that is familiar with the ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas coming out from Europe. The historian Jalil Jalili has, you know, referred to this period as the Kurdish Enlightenment, which I think is a good term for this word. So given that, you know, integration into the Ottoman apparatus of state, the Ottoman state was not viewed as a prison house of people, but rather an opportunity structure. And the Ottoman elite played a significant role in the development of the constitutionalist opposition. We use the term Young Turk, but the Young Turk movement itself was an ethnically diverse movement dominated by a variety of Ottoman Muslims. For example, Dr. Abdullah Cevdet and Dr. Ishak Skuti were amongst the movement's founders, and other Kurdish, quote-unquote, Young Turks included Osman and Mahmoud Bedekhan, who were part of the Committee of Union and Progress Egypt branch, who published the newspaper Osmanlı. You have members of the Baban family, Hikmet Baban, who represented Kurdish interests at the 1902 Congress of Ottoman Liberals in Paris. Babanzadeh Ismail Hakkı Bey, who was who as a youth was involved in protests against the Sultan. He refused to take sweets during Ramadan, during Ramadan, sweets from the Sultan, and got into trouble for that, became a journalist. And of course, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Effendi, the son of Sheikh Ubaidullah, who resided in Istanbul and had been involved in a Committee of Union and Progress military plot to overthrow Abdul Hamid in 1896. So for these individuals, the central political question of the age was the same as it was for many other Turkish and Arab and Albanian intellectual and political elites. It was not whether or not we should establish a separate state, but rather, as historian Tariq Zafer Tunay put it, how can this state be saved? So many of these elites were dedicated to the salvation of the Ottoman state. And we see this in the pages of the first Kurdish newspaper, Kurdistan, which was published with the support of the Committee of Union and Progress. If we read some of the articles from this newspaper, we see a very pro-constitutionalist elan to the newspaper. The remedy for all is the Ottoman constitution. When the constitution is fully implemented, then the people will be aware of their rights, and the curse of a despotic emperor and his civil servants will vanish. Thereafter, missionaries will not corrupt our people, and even Western states will not interfere in our affairs. In another article, Abdurrahman Bedepan, again the founder of the editor of this newspaper, noted that the health of the state is our health, and the demise of the state is our demise. So, in political terms, the newspaper Kurdistan was very much in line with the ideology expressed by the Kurdish Society for Mutual Aid and Progress. The primary difference is that prior to the revolution, this pro-constitutionalism was an opposition ideology, whereas after the constitutional revolution, it was an ideology in line with that of the Ottoman government. Now, at this point, I want to kind of move to the provincial branches of the Kurdish Society of Mutual Aid and Progress. And here I want to raise an extremely important point that Janet Klein, a well-known historian of the Kurds, has pointed out, is that like the CUP, the provincial affiliates of the Kurdish Society of Mutual Aid and Progress were not formed on the initiative of the central branch, but rather were formed by individuals locally who then sought to affiliate with this central branch. And this is kind of interesting because it exposed a split within the Kurdish community. Although you have these provincial branches, ideologically, these branches were often shaped by local circumstances, and there was some, variety between these. We have, from my research, I found that there were the branches I've been able to confirm existed included Diyarbakir, Van, Bitlis, Hunis, Mush, Musul, and Malatya. There was some difference for these. For example, the Malatya branch, from what I can tell, tended to be pro-constitutionalist. During the 1909 failed counter-coup against the constitutionalist order, the branch sent a telegram supporting the constitution. But with regards to the other branches, there seems to have been a kind of different orientation. So, for example, with the Diyarbakir branch, one British observer noted that all dervishes during the foundation ceremony of the local branch, all dervishes from all four quarters of the city, bearing religious flags, passed through the streets, followed by the great multitude shouting Salvat. And on entering the mosque, they took an oath to be faithful to the Shariati Muhammadiyya, or Islamic law, and to the Padishah. Moreover, after the ceremony, there was a petition circulated calling for the restoration of Islamic law. And there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm for this new regime. This term Kanuni Asasi, constitution, included within it this word Kanun, which for some referred to, had a kind of secular meaning to it, as opposed to the idea of Islamic law. So there was a lot more skepticism in these provincial branches. Now, I should note that, many of the announcements from provincial branches in the society's newspaper expressed support for the constitutional order. But on the ground, things were quite different. So, for example, when an individual in Sirt attempted to establish a branch linked to the club in Bitlis, it turned out, at least according to Ottoman documents, that he was apparently attempting to incite the local population against the constitution. And in Bitlis in particular, there was an attempted anti-Young Turk coup in April 1909. During the coup, the local branch basically captured Young Turk officers and forced them to send a message in support of the coup makers. So in the provinces, we see the provincial branches of this organization having a far more ambiguous relationship to the new constitutionalist order, despite organizing ostensibly within the same political organization. So what explains this? Well, we need to go back to the Hamidian period. One of the great policies of Sultan Abdulhamid was this politics of Islamic unity, which, of course, as I noted, included ideological appeals, but also material appeals to various Muslim notables across the empire, including many Kurds. One of the main vectors for the distribution of patronage amongst Kurdish tribes, for example, was the very well-known Hamidiya light cavalry regiments. These Hamidiya tribes were able to use this patronage and support to seize lands and properties from Armenians as well as from Kurds, and became very, as I noted, became well known in Europe for their brutal attacks on Armenians. And the government's sort of lack of interest in suppressing this. And even in areas where the Hamidiya regiments were not established, we have, for example, powerful and influential Sufi sheikhs who receiving patronage from the Sultan, such as Sheikh Ali Talabani in Kirkuk and Sheikh Said Barzinji in Suleymaniye, Abu Bakr Hazim, who was an official who served there, made a note that, when he complained to the government about these individuals, fighting or looting or doing illegal things, the Sultan would reply, it's not appropriate to banish them, the sheikhs, and it's not appropriate to banish the sheikhs and grandees of Islam upon the accusations of Armenians, even though in Suleymaniye there were no Armenians giving accusations. And so, many tribal leaders in Kurdistan had a positive relationship with the autocracy, and their skepticism of the revolution was not unfounded. Within very short order from the, after the revolution, many of the most famous allies of Sultan Abdulhamid in Kurdistan, such as Ibrahim Milli Pasha, a Hamidiya commander who established a kind of parallel state based in the town of Buran-Shahir, was forced to go on the run, where he eventually died, not because he was killed by Ottoman forces. Apparently he got dysentery and passed away. Another powerful individual was Sheikh Saidi Barzinji, who was exiled to Mosul, where in 1909 he was murdered by a mob in the city. And again, this was seen by provincial leaders who had close relations with the Sultan as being evidence that the Young Turks meant them harm. So we see in the provincial in the provinces, there's a far more skeptical disposition to the new order, again, based on the patronage that many Kurdish notables in the region had received. So what does this tell us? Well, the revolution and the formation of the society, it's a significant moment in that it marked the emergence of an organized Kurdish movement. When people talk about the birth of Kurdish nationalism, I would, for example, make the argument that Kurdish nationalism as an ideological discourse, it predates the formation of an organized Kurdish movement. You have Sheikh Ubaidullah speaking in nationalist terms in the 1880s. You have figures such as the poet Haji Kadri Koyi writing nationalistic poetry during the 1880s and 1890s and calling for the creation of a Kurdish state. But expressions of Kurdish political identity, some of which were nationalist, some of them were, for example, more scholarly. So, for example, in Egypt, we see the formation of an association dedicated to the publication of Kurdish language works. primarily scholarly, but we do have political manifestations of Kurdishness before this revolution. But after the revolution, we see the formation of a more organizationally sophisticated Kurdish movement, a distinct Kurdish movement. So, for example, the newspaper Kurdistan was part of the general Young Turk movement. It was financed and supported by the Young Turks. After the revolution, we see through the formation of a distinct Kurdish civil society, through the foundation of the Kurdish Society of Mutual Aid and Progress, the emergence of a distinct Kurdish movement. And although the organization was disbanded in 1908, following the 1908 counter-revolution, Kurds continued to organize civil society organizations after 1908. There was, often erroneously, historians will say that after 1908, the new law on associations banned national clubs. That's not quite the case. They banned national clubs from engaging in politics. So, many of the old members of the Kurdish Society of Mutual Aid and Progress went on to found in 1910 a kind of rebranded version of this organization in Istanbul that focused explicitly on education and avoided political questions. And, there are other Kurdish organizations established leading up to the First World War. We have the Friends of Kurdistan Society. We have the Society for, we have the Kurdish Students' Hope Society being established. So this marks the beginning of a proliferation of Kurdish civil society organizations. Now, what's interesting, though, is that within the KSMP, we find two tendencies after the revolution being represented. The central branch is established by Kurdish political and intellectual elites in Istanbul, many of whom had been involved in the Young Turk Revolution and were supportive of that revolution. Whereas in the provinces, it was established on the initiative of local leaders, many of whom were more skeptical about the revolution for both ideological and material reasons. So a kind of concluding point when we fit this into the story of Kurdish nationalism, the KSMP, like many Kurdish organizations, was ideologically a heterodox organization. But it's interesting that the splits within that organization were not between, for example, those who wanted separatist state and those who wanted maybe autonomy or cultural rights, but between pro and anti-constitutionalist factions. So this did not, the emergence of the Kurdish movement did not signal a rejection of Ottomanism. For the pro-constitutionalists, this organization was a vehicle through which the Kurds would be modernized, through which the Kurdish intellectual and political elite could find a place within a new constitutional order. Whereas for the anti-constitutionalist faction, it was a vehicle through which the privileges they enjoyed could be maintained. So at this point, the Kurdish movement, although becoming sophisticated, was not primarily shaped by the question of statehood. It would only be in later eras that this question would once again come to the fore. And this was not because nationalism or Kurdish nationalism was a completely unknown entity, but it was because the Ottoman Empire was seen not as a prison house of people, but as an opportunity structure for Ottoman Kurdish political elites. So that's all I have time for in my talk. That I hope it was helpful, and we will move on to questions.
Indeed, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. Tons of sparks, a lot of possible avenues to pursue, but just a few words before I pass on the mic to the audience for questions. First of all, how to put it, the simplistic look that contemporary nationalism kind of casts on the past, in the Kurdish case particularly, really erases a lot of complexity, interesting aspects. And I appreciate your distinction between national movement and nationalism. I think one of the scholars of nationalism from Eastern Europe makes that distinction, and I found it very apt when it comes to, given my interest in Said Nursi, I thought, yeah, this captures the reality of these people. It's attaching national movements to political aspirations of nationalism is not always helpful. So maybe one last comment from me would be that it seems KSMP is different from, let's say, Sheikh Ubaidullah rebellion and others, in the sense that it is the kind of genesis of Kurdish body politic. Its civil societal character makes it not a movement of a particular political actor, individual, or it's an institution, a very important element of modernity. So I will stop here, and we have some questions here. Professor Göçek is among us. Welcome, Müge Hoca. Good to see you. So maybe if you want to say a few words in response to what I said, if not, we can move on to Müge Hanım's question in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I assume you're referring to Miroslav Hosh, who has written on the periodization of nationalism. So
Yeah.
I agree with his periodization of nationalism in a kind of general sense, but of course, and he explicitly points this out, this is with reference to the formation of nationalist movements, especially amongst quote unquote small nations in Europe. And I think we should, and I think he would agree with this, we shouldn't completely try and import his model directly entirely to the Middle East. I think an important thing to understand about the formation of Kurdish nationalism is, I use the Trotskyist concept of combined uneven development. And what I mean by that is, combined uneven development is an economic terminology that refers to that you often, late developing countries will often have the most modern aspects of industry and industry alongside, relatively backwards forms of industry, like in Istanbul, they didn't build a 19th century style subway system. They built a modern subway system. So they have the very most modern one. And I think this is true ideologically speaking. Kurdish Kurdish nationalism doesn't sort of grow from a cultural enlightenment towards a kind of political nationalism. Rather, before 1908, from the destruction of the Kurdish emirs in the sort of early 19th century to the 1908 revolution, we have various expressions of modern Kurdish nationalism, but without a clear ideological base, and shaped in part by sociological changes within the Kurdish community, but also shaped by global changes. That is to say, the globalization of the principle of nationality. So when we look at there's a huge debate about the Sheikh Ubaidullah revolt. When we look about, is the Sheikh Ubaidullah revolt nationalist or not, I refer to the terminology used by my old professor, John Bruley, who talks about functions of nationalism. What is the nationalism doing? Well, in the Sheikh Ubaidullah revolt, I would be skeptical that nationalism is the mobilizing force of many of these people. But certainly, Ubaidullah is using the discourse of nationalism, which is a kind of international discourse during this period, to make claims on the Ottoman state, to have a common ideological framework through which to communicate with Europeans. So in a sense, he was a kind of revolutionary in that sense, in that he's drawing on the global discourse of nationalism to frame his revolt. Again, you have the poetry of Haji Khadri Koyi as well. And again, that is another good example of like drawing on this. Koyi explicitly, for example, Koyi has a very ambiguous disposition towards the Armenians. On one hand, he sees them as a threat. They'll turn Kurdistan into Armenia. But on the other hand, they're an exemplar of what Kurds should be doing. They should be doing education, etc., etc. So the kind of first phase, Hodge talks about the first phase of national movements as being, scholarly, right? I would argue that the first stage of Kurdish nationalism is both scholarly and political, but what defines it as a first stage is that it lacks a distinct organizational basis. Sheikh Ubaidullah adopts bourgeois ideology in a sense. He adopts the kind of bourgeois nationalism, but there's no basis for that bourgeois nationalism for a sustained activism. So it's only, the 1908 revolution marks the emergence of bourgeois politics amongst the Kurds, not nationalism, but bourgeois politics in the sense that political activism is located within civil society. So we have before the 1908 revolution sporadic expressions of Kurdish identity and different forms. The ideology of the KSMP is prefigured in the ideology of Kurdistan newspaper, right? And it's not like the authors of Kurdistan newspaper weren't aware of Haji Qadri Koyi's nationalism, because they were taught by Haji. He was their tutor and things like that. But they rejected the separatism in favor of this Ottoman constitutionalism, because for them the Kurdish question was not one of national oppression. The Kurdish question was broader. I like to use the concept of the politics of nationality. And what I mean by the politics of nationality is that, the modern world, nationalism is impelled by two, we can think of nationalism being forcing people to pick a national identity. And the forces behind that come both from below in terms of sociological change, but also come from above in terms of changes in global ideology. So when we look at the origins of Kurdish nationalism or the Sheikh Ubaidullah revolt, I like to compare them to nationalism in the Balkans, where you have these rebellions that become national over time, because nationalism is now emerging as the dominant ideology of this period. Sheikh Ubaidullah is adopting nationalism in a period of crisis because that is the framework of an alternative political order. So that's the way that he's looking at it. But it's not until 1908 that we see the emergence of the sustained and distinctly organized form of Kurdish civil society.
Thank you. Müge Hocam, would you like to speak, or you want your question to be read?
I can speak. It'll be easier. This was
Okay.
a wonderful talk. I mean, especially since we're talking finally about articulating Kurdish history from the vantage point of the Kurds by giving agency to them, rather than doing it through sort of the Turkish nationalist context. So that, I think, is wonderful. And of course, you're sort of getting into sociology here when you use issues of modernity, nationalism and such. And from that vantage point, I do understand that, the Young Turk revolution is when these civil society organizations emerge, across all different subjects of the Ottoman Empire, including the Kurds. And of course, I know the Armenians better because of my work on the Armenians. But nevertheless, what's very interesting for me is, yes, I do agree that institutionally, that is when the Kurdish movement becomes publicly visible. But I would argue, that especially, drawing on Janet Klein's work, the first conflict between the subjects of the empire start much earlier, around 1838, where Kurds are, the emirates are, abolished, and Kurds are forcibly integrated into the Ottoman system. And that is when they start, of course, clashing with the Armenians. And then that is when the Ottoman state intervenes. I mean, so we're talking 1840s, 50s. I think if you look at what happens afterwards, I mean, that is, I think, the way those two are treated gives you a sense of that's the first time they, I think, are seen as minorities, or they become minorities of the empire. And that I would argue, is the sort of origin of the Kurdish movement. It is sort of that initial, interaction, conflict, I would say, with the Armenians that I think make both sort of communities develop national identities of their own. And of course, I don't think Kurds are taken on yet because they're Muslims, but that is why I think the Ottomans go after the Armenians. I mean, the young Turks that actually did this revolution are the ones that also committed the Armenian genocide, if you think about it. I mean, that dramatic shift from what they envisioned to what became actualized, I think foreshadows also what then happens to the Kurds later on. To Ziya Gökalp and all those other people. So I wonder what you think about that. I mean, I have no problems with what you have articulated. You've done a beautiful job of showing how institutionally that is indeed when it starts. But where would you sort of trace the origins of the Kurdish movement itself?
I mean, in terms of you're right. The abolition of the emirates is an extremely important moment, retrospectively as well, because what's important is not just that the emirates are disbanded, but also the fate of the emirs.
Exactly.
So, for example, Bedr Khans and Babans were not liquidated. They were integrated into the Ottoman political elite. And that's an important development because that's partly explains the political orientation of the Kurdish movement that emerges later. These people are Ottomanized to a certain degree, but they don't lose their cultural and political identity. In fact, that cultural and political identity becomes important during the Hamidian period because it becomes a way to claim a position in the Ottoman government. The Sultan Abdulhamid is appointing Bedr Khans left, right, and center based on their family into the Ottoman administration. And they remain highly influential right down to 1906. And of course, those of you who may or may not be aware, the Bedr Khans basically fell out with the Ottoman government, basically because one member of the family got angry at the local municipality and beat someone with a shovel. And small things can lead to big things. So I think these are all extremely important moments in not only talking about the emergence of the sociological base of the movement, but also, the political decisions taken by the Ottoman state also shaped the Kurdish response to Ottoman modernity. I mean, in my research, there were, in the early 2000s, you have Hakan Ozolu, you have Sinclair, you have Janet Klein, you have several people, writing important works on the origins of Kurdish nationalism. Azad Arslan is another one, less known, but his PhD is a really good one. Their central question is, when is Kurdish nationalism beginning, right? And why did Kurdish nationalism fail? And, that's a fine question, but I want, with my research, to move on from that question, because what I find more interesting is how and why do different elements of the Kurdish elite mobilize their identity in different ways? What are the circumstances through which identity was shaped? So the abolition of the old, I call it the ethno-feudal order. For 300 years of Ottoman rule, you have the ethno-feudal order in Ottoman Kurdistan. That is to say, there's nothing particularly unique about the autonomy that Kurds are given during this period. But what is significant is that autonomy is framed in terms of, the Kurds, right? Ottoman documents refer to the Kurds as a collective. Right?
Yeah.
Now, there aren't modern political implications of that, but the particular administrative arrangements in Kurdistan before the 19th century are conceptualized both by the Kurdish notable classes and the Kurdish and the Ottoman state in terms of the appropriate leadership of Kurdistan. And for the Ottoman state, that is the Kurdish emirs, and obviously that. And those perceptions, go on to shape how modernity is experienced in Kurdistan. And so obviously, like you say, important preconditions for the Kurdish movement can be traced back right down to the abolition of the emirates and how this is shaped, for example, as you rightly associate, I implied this in my talk, we often think of nationalism amongst quote unquote minority groups, or I prefer the term small nations, as Hodge does, is often a result of national oppression, right? But in the Kurdish case, it is less a question of national oppression, but more about how to reorganize the relationship with the state, and also how to relate to other Ottoman nationalities. The Armenian movement is extremely influential. There's a dialectical relationship there, but also the Arab movement, etc. These all affect the Kurds. When we look at the Sheikh Ubaydullah revolt, there is perhaps an exaggeration of his anti-Christian elan that was probably, a result of Ottoman officials trying to turn the Europeans against Sheikh Ubaydullah. But if we look at the Kurdish response, we have in the early 19th century, Kurdish emirs resist modernization. And then you have a phase, in the 1850s where there is a kind of restorationist movement, an attempt to restore the old emirs with the Yazdan Shir revolt. And then Sheikh Ubaydullah, who himself his rise to political power is a product of modernity as well. He, becomes a kind of revolutionary in a way, in that he advocates a political solution to the unrest in Kurdistan, not in terms of a restoration of traditional Kurdish autonomy, but the formation of a Kurdish political entity that, the historical narrative of Ottoman modernization in Kurdistan is often implicitly framed in terms of a modernizing state dealing with a backwards society, right, that refuses to modernize. But what's really happening is there's a dialectical relationship, and a sheikh in the sheikh and a agha in the 1890s are very different from a sheikh and a agha in the 1820s in terms that they are economically and politically brought into the global economy, right?
Exactly.
The rise of the sheikhs as a political caste in Kurdish society is a product of modernity itself. It's not so you have this disconnect between an intelligentsia in the capital that's highly Ottomanized, and then people in the provinces who, for them, Ottoman modernization means more taxes, more oppression, and more disorder. And so this is Sabri Atesh has written quite well on this. It's within this context that we see the emergence, not so much of a movement, but of Kurdish nationalism as an ideological response to the failures of Ottoman modernism. But it is only really when you have the maturation of an intellectual and professional elite that you can, an urban intellectual and professional elite, that we can really have this kind of sustained Kurdish political activism. It provides that important social base. So I would distinguish between organizational and ideological debates. Before 1908, you have this sporadic manifestations of Kurdish nationalism in response to Armenian nationalism, state reform, etc., etc. After 1908, we actually have a sustained Kurdish civil society.
But I totally agree with what you're saying. It would be interesting to look at the Armenians as a sort of weak comparison, so to speak, because they too actually have this metropolitan and provincial divide in the way they negotiate modernity as well. I mean, I try to trace that in my Denial of Violence book, where I also refer to what the Kurds and other Greeks, Rum and other groups were also doing at the same time. So this is amazing. I mean, you've fine-tuned what I said, and more power to you. Okay.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions. One of them is about the Kurdish Ottomanism, whether there is a similar opportunity structure for Kurds in Turkey today. That's Sachiko Nagai's question.
I mean, today, obviously, we're in a very different political climate. I think one of the big differences today is that Ottomanism was a very flexible ideology, right? It could be very easily appropriated by non-Turkish groups. Obviously, within the concept of Ottomanism itself, there are the roots of Turkish nationalism, because when even in the 19th century, when people were talking about Ottoman civilization, there was a linguistic aspect to it. That was knowledge of Ottoman Turkish. Yeah, there's also a religious aspect to it, and there's of course the civic political aspect to it. But that being said, it was a vague enough ideology that it could be assimilated. In Turkey today, I mean, the official nationalism of the state is far more, ethno-nationalism. So there's far less political space through which to accommodate, ideologically accommodate the concept of being part of both a cultural and a political nation, right? So, and or to put it another way, is that in Turkey you kind of have a weirder situation today, in a sense that the Turkish state and mainstream Turkish political parties have, for example, been able to represent the quote unquote ethnic interests of Kurds on the conservative side of politics, but the Turkish political left has not. And so, when we look at the AKP, for example, they're the only national party in Turkey. I remember, like, I had a dinner with some AKP businessmen, and it was quite funny because the Karadenizli guy was talking about how Kurds breed too much, whereas the guy from Diyarbakir was talking about how we're all Muslim brothers and things like that. And these issues were worked out within the party, whereas even when we look at the origins of Dem Party, HDP, and all these things, they come out of a split within Turkish social democracy, and that split has never really been healed. So, today there is some space, I think, for a kind of Islamic, Kurdish Turkish nationalism, but for a secular version, it's pretty chaotic. So I think the ideological climate is quite different from that. And it's also important to remember that, nationalism is it's a modern phenomenon, but it's also a historic phenomenon. And it goes through different phases. So of course, and different versions. You have a liberal democratic version, you have an ethnic nationalist version. So, up until 1918, there was still a belief amongst many people in multinational empires that people could live together. After the First World War, we come to the position of a kind of profound pessimism that groups can live together, and of course that leads to further polarization. So we have a distinct set of political circumstances, post-Ottoman circumstances, that shape Kurdish nationalism in Turkey.
Jen, there are two comparative questions. One is Kani Ghulam's. CUP supporting the birth of the newspaper Kurdistan in Egypt reminds me of the British government's decision to support the Indian National Congress in India. The question is whether Erdogan is cultivating a similar relationship with Hüdapar as a way of so that question, what does it say about the future?
I would say be wary of projecting today's things back into the past, because the Young Turks were not a Turkish organization. That was just a term that people gave, and the term Turk at that period even was understood differently. You have Abdullah Cevdet saying something like, I love Turkey, and I forget the quote exactly, but I love Turkey, and I'm a Turk. I love Turkey, but I'm a Kurd, and I love Kurdishness. It's because Turk was often used as a shorthand for Ottoman, and it did not necessarily have the same implications as it might have today. Obviously, language is a bit different. And the CUP was not a Turkish organization. Two of its founders were Kurds. A big financier, Abdullah Cevdet, who was the CUP go-to guy that the Kurdistan newspaper was getting its money from. It was another Kurd, right? Kurds participated at all levels. They did not view themselves as a minority in the sense that we might today. They viewed themselves as an element. And this is very important. This was the concept used at the time. Ittihadi Anasar, unity of elements. They viewed themselves as obviously they take this concept from science. This is the age of vulgar materialism. They take this concept. They aren't viewing themselves as part of an oppressed nation or a minority. They are ruling themselves as part of the Ottoman ruling nation. And that creates a very different disposition. And the CUP was so there were Turkic nationalist factions within the CUP, but there were other factions as well.
Exactly.
And so that's important. And when the split in the organization happened in 1902, the Kurds sided with the centralizing faction over the decentralizing faction. So I think we should be careful about projecting back the circumstances today into the past. Yes, we could see parallels, but in opposition, the Kurds don't see themselves as distinct from other communities in the Ottoman Empire, and the political objective of this movement is constitutionalism. Constitutionalism is a revolutionary ideology, right, during this period. And, when we think of revolutionary ideology post-1917, we think of socialism and Marxism. But for the 19th century, it was liberalism that was the revolutionary ideology. And liberalism is the ideological framework through which this is done. So if you want to think of a comparison, I would say the comparison is better with the reemergence of the Kurdish movement in Turkey in the 1960s, where again, the movement is not split so much between separatist nationalists and other groups, but between those who seek to accommodate with the Turkish state through constitutionalist activities, dolculuk, all these kind of ideologies, and those who see the resolution of the Kurdish question within the context of a socialist revolution in Turkey. I think that's a good parallel where, liberalism is playing the role of socialism. Liberalism in the 1910s is playing the role of socialism in the 1960s as an ideological framework through which you can have a multicultural nationalism.
Djene, a couple of quick questions. One is on the relationship between Kurdish national movement and Arab nationalism.
I mean, I don't feel super confident about talking about Arab nationalism so much during this period. But yes, I mean, especially when we talk about Muslim Arabs, I think we see similar ideological trends. I think one of the big differences between Arabs and Kurds is that, within the Arab community, you have Christians who are often at the vanguard of nationalism because they don't have that ideological framework of Islamism to bond them to the Ottoman state. Perhaps if there'd been a large quote unquote Kurdish Christian community, they might have served as a kind of vanguard of Kurdish nationalism during this period. But there is, I'd say that's probably a kind of difference between the movements. But in terms of its organization, I think there are similarities, but obviously there are differences, because you have Arab nationalism emerging in other parts outside of the Ottoman Empire as well. So yes, I would say there's parallels. And of course, the rise of Arab nationalism affects the Kurdish movement as well. Although the Kurds often refer to the Armenians as their closest neighbors, often compare themselves to the Armenians, the rise of Arab nationalism, the revolts in Yemen and places like that during the Committee of Union, during the Young Turk era, these were things known to Kurdish people who they paid attention to these kind of developments.
Yeah. Djene, I think you briefly touched upon this question, but the question is, with the liquidation of Kurdish emirates in the 19th century, what filled the political vacuum?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think I think the state is attempting to fill that vacuum, right? But the Ottoman state doesn't have the resources necessary to revolutionize Kurdistan to the same way. The bourgeois state, the capitalist state, the bureaucratic state, whatever you want to call it, has a kind of transformative impulse, but it also has an impulse towards order as well. And so, during the Tanzimat, we see a kind of attempt to transform Kurdish society, but there isn't the resources to do so. And so you have a kind of power vacuum emerging, and it's into this power vacuum that we see the growth of the sheikhs as political leaders, as the leaders of tribes. And you can see this in Ottoman documents, right? And what I mean by that is, I mentioned, for example, Abu Bakr Tepeyan, who was an Ottoman official in Mosul during the late 19th century. And he makes the statement, he goes, Kurds call the tribal leaders sheikhs. But this is a mistake because Kurds don't call tribal leaders sheikhs. So why is he making this mistake? Well, it's because sheikhs in the late 19th century had become extremely powerful tribal leaders in a way they hadn't been before. They had often served as intermediaries between the emirs and the Ottoman state, you know, like sometimes, like, for example, Sheikh Ubaidullah's grandfather, I think, he had been the guy, Bedr Khan Bey, sent to the Ottomans to do negotiations, right? But they move into this political vacuum. And so the role of the sheikhs is transformed by modernity into these political leaders. And we see sheikhs becoming to be seen as tribes. When you look at the evolution of the Barzani tribe that we call tribe today, if you go to documents from the 1890s, they call it Barzani Jama'ata. They call it the Barzani community. It's presented as there's an Ottoman document saying like, yeah, it's a religious movement. Somebody's declaring him. There's an evil Chaldean woman that have told the Barzanis to declare themselves the Mahdi, and they're attracting support under the Sheikh. But by 1910, they're talking about Barzani Ashireta because the Sheikhs have consolidated that leadership and it's become, tribalized, as it were. So modernity revolutionizes Kurdish society, but we don't see that. We often don't see that because we're beholden to the kind of progressive state versus reactionary periphery politics, when in fact this relationship is dialectical in the sense that even if you go back to the Bedr Khan revolt, or the final resistance of the Babans in Baghdad, in Suleymania, they themselves are transforming under modernity. Bedr Khan Bey is centralizing political power. Ahmed Pasha Baban is dressing his soldiers up in European-style uniforms that he's learned from Russian renegades, and is trying to consolidate power as well in a kind of similar way to, let's say, someone like on a small scale, like a mini Mehmet Ali of Egypt, right? So we're seeing this, and these sheikhs are not the resurgence of Kurdish traditional society, but they are people who have been elevated under conditions of modernity. And that this is only consolidated in the Hamidian period, where they become, capitalist farmers producing for the international market. That the Kurdish question during the Hamidian era is being driven by economic transformations. It's not for naught that this is being called a land question, right? So we have a crisis because the bureaucratic state, on one hand, has the impulse to transform Kurdistan, but its failure to do so in the Tanzimat, manifest in the Sheikh Ubaidullah revolt, leads it to take this more conservative approach, which again transforms the role of Kurdish tribes, transforms the role of the economy in Kurdistan. And of course, as Zahra Pahlivan has talked about in her books on this is also being shaped by environmental change, economic crisis. Kurdistan is not isolated on the moon, right? It is a frontier zone between empires. So it is not, and so ideas, economic trends and things are flowing into this region. So we really have to shake this idea that, what happens in the 19th century is that you have a modernizing state meeting a medieval society, but rather you have a dialectical relationship between the Kurdish periphery and the Ottoman center, and the failures during the Tanzimat are what gives rise to, for example, the Sheikh Ubaidullah, who sees the nation state as it's kind of the borders pushing back at the failures of the Tanzimat era, and attempting to provide an alternative political order in the framework of a nation state, but a nation state that lacks a kind of strong intelligentsia, at least until later, that can provide the kind of ideological weaponry a nationalist movement needs.
All right. So there are 2 or 3 questions. If you could keep brief answers, well, we would like to finish by answering all of them. So thank you. I truly enjoy your responses. The next one is from Shamal, and it's about the CUP. Why within CUP? When did the shift from Ottomanism or Islamism to Turkish nationalism happen, if it did?
Well, the CUP is like a very like is like the KSMP is an ideologically heterodox organization, and evolves over time. The CUP in 1914 is not the same CUP as in 1908. You have continuous political crises in the Ottoman Empire, and the and it's only really with the Baba Ali coup that you have this cabal of Talat, Jamal, and Enver Pasha coming to power, and but they too are kind of like ideologically heterodox in a certain way. you know for example, in 1914, the CUP basically concedes all the cultural demands of the Arab movement in the Arab provinces, except Arabic language education, while at the same time, in this very same period, they're moving towards sort of more assimilationist policies towards the Kurds. So the CUP are political opportunists. They don't have like a fixed ideology, as it were, and it's not really Turkish nationalism in its entirety, but there's a kind of the CUP is playing with both Turkish nationalist themes, pan-Islamist themes, pan-Turkish themes. It depends who they're talking to. People compare Erdogan to I think the most Erdogan is very much like a true successor to late stage CUP nationalism, in that he's an opportunist, right? What makes Erdogan so successful is his opportunism. He isn't burdened by, for example, hardline Kemalist anti-Kurdism, right? Now, of course, maybe we can say Erdogan is anti-Kurd, but he's playing a very much more sophisticated game in that he's able to include Kurdish interests within his political party. The CUP was able to do the same thing too. So that there is not like a strong Turkish nationalist direction really directed towards the Kurds until we begin to see it. We begin to see it in the First World War, because we have this important Talimat Nama on refugees, right? And this 1916 Talimat is really important because it makes a distinction between how Turkish refugees should be treated and how Kurdish refugees should be treated, right? So we do begin to see this during the war. We see that there's this book published after the war by, it's a fake book. It's written by quote unquote Dr. Fitch, but actually it's not really written by him. It's written by an Albanian, and basically who just makes the original arguments that Kurds aren't really a nation, right? In fact, a lot of later books, I'm thinking of Abdul Haluk Chai's, Kürt dossier book, basically just rip off a lot of things from that original book from 1920. The main difference is in that book that in the Kürt dossier, the 200 words that are labeled of unknown origin are actually labeled of as Kurdish origin in the original. He just, takes it out of the original. So we do begin to see kind of the Kurds come to be seen as, okay, the CUP leadership comes maybe around 1914, comes to the idea like, maybe we can assimilate these Kurds, but we aren't going to be able to assimilate these Arabs, so we might as well concede to them. So they're conceding to one group on one hand, and they're trying to assimilate a group on another hand. But really, that only becomes strongly defined after the formation of the Republic of Turkey and this kind of assimilationist nationalism that the Republic of Turkey takes.
Right, thank you. Next question you might have answered, but I'm gonna read it. Why did the Kurdish intellectuals of that period prefer Ottomanism instead of nationalism, even though there were examples of nationhood in such an early period?
I mean, it's basically because why would you want to become the Grand Vizier of a small Kurdish state when you could become the Grand Vizier of a big empire, right? These people had like big positions, good salaries, good government. The Ottoman government was not discriminating against them on the basis of their Kurdish identity. And in fact, that they, again, draw the comparison with the Scots. The Scots didn't reject their national identity during the, Act of Union, but rather the Act of Union came to be seen as a way to which Scots could advance themselves within the British Empire as a whole. So, this was not, this was, the Ottoman Empire was not seen as oppressing Kurds. Kurds saw it as their state. You see this very clearly in Kurdish newspapers. In Kurdistan, they're always complaining about the Ottoman state, not because it's oppressing them, but because it's doing a bad job at defending the Ottoman Empire. And, they identify very strongly with the interests of the state because they are the cadre of the state, right? They do have jobs in the state. There are field marshals. They are MPs. They are all people integrated into the into the Ottoman establishment, because this is not a Turkish establishment. This is a multicultural establishment. And these people have spent time, they know each other, they've spent time with each other, they're friends, they were at high school together, right down to the 1960s, like these people are all friends together, so you have this quote unquote class solidarity, but class from the fact that they were in the same class at school, right? That they had the same wet nurses, they had the same thing. So this was a very different political atmosphere. This was a time where there was a belief that, you could reconcile a kind of political nationalism of loyalty to a state like the Ottoman state with a cultural nationalism which seeks the advancement of a particular community within that state through civil society and not through the creation of a nation state.
Excellent. A question from our colleague Bahadin Kerborani, and so you refer to Kurdish notables, nobility, let's call them, and then there are these non-elite Kurds like Khalil Khayali, Saidi Kurdi, Kurdizade Ahmet Ramiz, and so on. If you could elaborate more on non-elite Kurdish intellectuals and the Ottoman modernization.
Sure. I mean, they are still elites in the broader thing of Kurdish society,
Sure.
but they come from a lower caste of elites. So, the kind of high caste of elites, the ones who are getting the real patronage from the Ottoman state, tend to be from these very notable families, Sheikh Abdul Qadir, and, they are, descendants of the Prophet, etc., etc. The Bedr Khans, the Babans, they're getting these elite positions. This lower rung of people, they're people, maybe their dad was a minor Ottoman official, maybe they're a local merchant. Good example, Pirinçcizadeler in Diyarbakir, for example. They aren't non-elites. But what they share with this big elite, this is what I mean by saying that there's an overlap between the kind of traditional notable classes and the intelligentsia. So you have these big notables who are also Ottoman intelligentsia, but then you also have people coming from less prestigious backgrounds who again are becoming part of this Ottoman intelligentsia as well. And within this Kurdish elite, especially during this early stage of, there is a kind of deference towards these big families, right? Even from now, later on, many of the people from less prestigious backgrounds begin to complain, saying like, oh, they're only given the top jobs go to these big families, but I'm just as well educated as them and things like that. But what's important here is like, all this elite sees its currency as being that they are, that they're educated, right, in modernity, that they are enlightened, that they're munavar, they are part of a modern intelligentsia. But within the Kurdish elite, obviously, there is still class differences, and there is still a conflict between various elements of the elite, not just vertically between those from, let's say, lower-ranking notables, but also horizontally between, for example, the Bedr Khans and Sheikh Abdul Qadir Effendi and his supporters, individuals from a princely background and individuals from a sheikhly background, because the Bedr Khans saw Sheikh Abdul Qadir Effendi as a kind of upstart. They were like, his grandfather was working for my grandfather, and now he thinks he's the boss of us. So you have these kind of elite level conflicts which are carrying over into this newly formed intelligentsia. This intelligence, like imagine a counterfactual. The Kurdish movement might have looked very different. Let's say the Ottomans had captured all the sheikhs, all the emirs, put a gun to their head, shot them all, eliminated this class, but then started recruiting from provincial backgrounds. Then the Kurdish elite might have looked quite different, right? because you wouldn't have had the continuation, this kind of linkage with the past, right? You know, the Ottoman state could have just excluded Kurds from this new elite, and then the Kurdish disposition towards the state in 1908 might have been a bit different, right? But Ottoman policies did very much shape how this elite came into existence, right? And this elite came into existence, and it had these divisions within it between people who all received a similar education, but who had different familial backgrounds. And those familial backgrounds still counted for something in Kurdish society. To put it another way, actually, I'll give you an example. You know, the Bedekhans between, you know, the 1870s and the 1930s transformed their identity, right? And they transformed their identity in a parallel way to the way a lot of monarchs in Europe transformed their identity, from being like a monarch to being a national monarch. So the Bedekhans reinvent themselves not as the princes of Jazira Botan, but as the true kings of Kurdistan. So Leyla Bedekhan, the dancer in Paris, calls Bedekhan the crown prince of Kurdistan. Kamuran Bedekhan is signing himself as prince of Kurdistan. So they transformed themselves during this modernization to being the, you have them trying to basically create themselves as the true national monarchs. And they have someone like Haji Kaji Koyu saying that, yeah, the Bedekhans are the true national monarchs. If you want to think of an analogy in a similar way to, even though the Kurds don't have a state in Turkey, the PKK attempted to establish a one-party nation in Turkey by establishing themselves as the single representative of the Kurdish movement. You see a parallel in this in the Bedekhans reinventing themselves as the true kings of all of Kurdistan and not just one amongst many Kurdish princes.
Thank you. Let's see if there are any other questions from the audience. I feel so guilty to, you know, to kind of end or stop you from talking more, because this is all really wonderful stuff. So I want to thank you for your presentation. I learned a lot, and I would love to compare notes with you on some of the aspects. Our next speaker is Nilay Özok Gündoğan from Florida State University, and she's going to talk about the Kurdish nobility in the Ottoman Empire. And this is going to be on May 1st, another Wednesday like this one at the same time. All right. So thanks a lot, everyone. And I see Sasha and a few other friends and our students from Zahra Institute's Kurdish Studies MA program. I want to thank you all for your participation. And we'll see you on May 1st. All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for a great presentation.